Hey party people, really excited today because we're going to be taking a look at video samples from the HTC One. Now this is a bold move for HTC, moving away from a higher megapixel camera, moving to a lower megapixel camera, but for these video samples, we're still looking at 1080p video. And of course, this marks the first HTC camera with optical image stabilization, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the video. So one thing that becomes immediately clear the second you fire this camera up is HTC has made a conscious decision to maximize lighting in every scenario that you use this camera for. The larger photo sites on this lower megapixel image sensor are just designed to soak up as much light as possible in every scenario that you might use this camera. As with many smartphone cameras, I really do feel that there is a tendency to overexpose the image. Unfortunately, I think this problem is slightly more pronounced on the HTC One than on some of the other cameras that I've used. Now, that's not to say you can't get amazing results out of this camera, it's just the stock settings that this camera uses, well, they really focus on boosting the available light in the scene. Now, happily, I do think that this situation is much improved from the camera on the HTC One X, which was hyper-aggressive in making adjustments to the exposure. Doing our normal brightly lit scene outdoor photography, you can see this camera does a wonderful job of picking up detail. In a wide open scene like this, you can see that the camera is hunting around for focus, but I found that genuinely, the camera does a pretty good job of locking when you give it a proper subject to look at. Moving into our street scene, you can see the camera does a great job of tracking movement, and thankfully, like I mentioned before, not too much of the sky is blown out, and the objects on the ground seem to be properly exposed. All around, I really do feel that this camera app is performing much better than the camera app on the HTC One X did. And it finally gets an HTC camera up to the level of cameras that we've seen in Samsung devices. Moving into a transition test, the camera blooms through the exposure range very, very smoothly. This might be a factor of the improved processing power of the new Qualcomm 600 series chip on board, but thankfully we see very pleasant transitions from light scenes to dark scenes and back. And here, even moving through the darker scene, the camera isn't hunting for focus as much as some other lower-end cameras we've seen. And while this camera isn't as hyperactive at adjusting the exposure as the HTC One X was, you can still see there are some dynamic range issues moving from sky to ground. There really is decent dynamic range built into this camera, but it really seems that some of that gets sacrificed to make sure the scene is as bright as possible. A quick look at the image stabilization on this camera, it helps reduce some of the shakiness, but honestly this really does seem to reinforce that HTC is looking more at the ability to maximize light than to smooth out the scene. In a situation where I'm hand-holding the camera and trying to walk at the same time, you can see where the optical image stabilization is having a hard time trying to smooth out the jerkiness of the camera movements. But even in scenes where I'm not walking around, HTC's system can still struggle a little with small hand movements. Moving into darker scenes, this is another area where we can really see a conscious decision on HTC's part to focus on maximizing available light. Unfortunately, I don't like that it often manifests itself by reducing the frame rate of the video. So rather than staying at a progressive 30 frames per second, whenever there isn't enough available light in the scene, the camera will actually drop down to 20 frames per second to make sure that the scene is well lit. I think this results in an overly jerky or stuttery video. But it becomes one of those preferences. Do you want a scene that's properly lit and a little less grainy, or do you want a scene that plays smoothly? I myself would rather have a grainier scene that plays smoothly than a jerkier scene that's properly lit. Though in a lot of these nighttime situations, if the subject of your video has any lighting on it whatsoever, then the camera will cycle back up to 30 frames per second. What's impressive about this new lower megapixel image sensor though is just how much light it can soak up. For example, in this scene with almost no available light, you can still make out the candle before I light it. And what the camera is able to do with only one candle light in a completely darkened room is pretty remarkable. And even though I haven't gotten my hands on the Galaxy S4 yet, I feel pretty comfortable calling the HTC One the best camera you can find in an Android phone today. That being said, how does it stack up against the Lumia 920? And for that, well, you're just gonna have to check back in later. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all on the next video.